Great speakers, huh? It's been amazing, right? When you say you've gotten your money's worth already, wouldn't you say you've already got your money's worth? That takes all the pressure off me. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. This is bonus material now. Doesn't matter what I say. Actually, Anthony back here, my colleague at AmPhil, can attest to this. The last conference I went to, I had to get up after a guy whose story was so good, so dramatic, so compelling that they had made it into a movie. Like, they made me follow that guy. So it could be worse. It could be worse. Actually, I didn't even know if I was even going to make it here today, because this is also a true story. Yesterday, I worked out yesterday morning. As you can tell, I'm a workout warrior. And I jacked up my back somehow really badly. I got here late. I was creaking. And then just sitting through the first talk, which was very good from Father James, it just totally seized up. And I made it out into the courtyard there. This is all true. And I couldn't move anymore. I called my wife. I'm like, you have to come get me. I can't walk. I can't stand. I can't bend. I can't do anything. It's really, really some of the worst pain I'd felt. And so I prayed. I said, God, if you will take away this great pain, I will in turn bring great pain to my audience tomorrow. And here we are. I feel great. So God answers prayers. That's a joke. Did not pray that. So it's not that bad. All right. So really have had so many great speakers, and a lot of what I'm going to cover will be a little bit familiar to you. I was trying to think about what to talk about when Peter invited me to do this, because I saw, Conde's on the agenda, and Andrew and Nick and all these really bright minds when it comes to fundraising. So I thought I would talk about the psychology of giving and maybe give you a little bit of a framework for thinking about it fruitfully. I did my doctorate in psychology, as you just heard. Fun fact, I hate psychology. That's something I learned when I was in graduate school. Like, I don't like this at all. Academic psychology is a mess, right? Did anybody study psychology here in school? All right, okay. Did you study at a Catholic, like a good Catholic? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about, right? It's a mess. We're just meat. We're meats. It's totally philosophically materialist, determinist. There's no free will. There is no psyche. There's nothing to study. Psychology, but there's no mind. Mind is just an epiphenomenon of the brain. We're all just animated meat. It should be called behavioral biology. So I didn't like the discipline very much. Now, I will say, in his defense, the discipline didn't much like me. I was a pretty bad psychologist. I went into clinical psychology because that's what they told you to do. It's hard to get into that. If you get into that, you can switch out to other areas. So I'm like, all right, I'll do that. And so here's the horrifying thing. My hand raiser's over here. Did you do a counseling or clinical degree? Okay. Well, okay. And did you do clinical or counseling? Okay. Well, good choice. Here's the thing. When you go to graduate school and you're in clinical psychology, they bring in people for you to see who have like real people with real problems, like right away. And I was horrified. I'm 23 years old, 22, 23 years old. I had nothing to say. I mean, in my philosophy of counseling at the time was, let's keep it light. Let's not delve too deeply here. This is very uncomfortable and awkward for me. So anyway, I was moved out of psychology pretty quickly. That's all unnecessary, totally unnecessary prologue to what I'm going to tell you today, I think. So here we go. What I want to do is just discuss some fundraising relevant findings. Some fundraising relevant findings from research into the psychology of giving and the psychology of human motivation. And then I'm going to go over this high-level conceptual framework for how I think we can think about fundraising in light of that research, how we can think fruitfully and well in a truly sort of a Catholic dimension about fundraising in light of that research. And then we'll talk about some practical applications of that framework, all right? So these are the most fundamental questions for the fundraiser in our practical everyday lives. How do you motivate people to give? What motivates people to give? How should you think about this seemingly simple task so that you can go about it successfully? Rather important questions, right? If we know what motivates people to give, then assuming such motivations are honorable and just, we're doing everyone a service if we can come to better understand how to tap into and feed those motivations. So that's what we're going to get into here. So as I say, this question, why do people give away their money, is obviously basic and vitally important for all of us in this room. We should consider it at some length. But I'll be honest, I co-founded AmPhil in 2009. I worked in the nonprofit world for about 8 years before that. Yet it was maybe only about 10 or so years ago that I kind of stopped to think about this question and try to figure out the answer and try to make a real effort. I just operated on the basis of a lot of implicit and assumed answers that I picked up in boardrooms or from what someone said or in the literature. And this is the kind of thing you would hear. People give to help those in need. Or maybe people give just to assuage guilt. That's more of you can hear that in academia maybe sometimes. Or maybe they give to obtain a tax break. Now we all know, you're pretty sophisticated in this room, that those aren't very sophisticated answers, right? That's not really why people give like real gifts, meaningful gifts. But you will hear things like, oh, people give to bring about social change, right? That's why people give. And then you get this most sophisticated answer that people give to get results. They give to make an impact. They give to receive a good return, good ROI, right? A good return on their investment. You heard that? That's why people give. That's certainly what some major donors will tell you why they give. Some major donors will tell you that's why they give. It's also why people are supposed to give, according to many experts in the field of philanthropy. The problem is, as I eventually found, that these kinds of answers aren't really backed up by the empirical evidence, nor do they find much support from the literature on human giving and motivation. And that really surprised me. So I started on my journey thanks to a friend named Bill Schambra. If you don't know the work of a guy named Bill Schambra, Schambra, you should. He's a great writer on philanthropy. Look him up, William Schambra. He led me to this study called Money for Good. And this is a very well-funded study from very big mainstream foundations. And its goal was to study donors' reasons for giving. And if possible, what they wanted to do is they wanted to nudge people toward these sort of more allegedly rational philanthropic processes. The findings were incredibly disappointing to the study's study's authors and funders. Money for Good wanted donors who look or act like those in the gold rectangle here. They wanted donors who did comparative research and looked at outcomes before they decided how they were going to give. They wanted donors who cared about impact metrics, getting the most bang for their buck. That all sounds pretty reasonable. Perhaps you want that too. Unfortunately, for the study's authors, Money for Good found that only 3% of donors undertake real research of any kind before they give. Usually the research donors would undertake before they give is just to make sure you're not a fraud, just to make sure you're real. In fact, what Money for Good showed was that the top 3 reasons donors give are as stated in the top left box here. They give because they have a relationship with someone at the organization. They give because the organization is local. They give because the organization shares their values. And that's not necessarily what the donors said about their giving, but it's what they did. It's all more hearty than heady, right? Donors, it turns out, are human beings. They're not rationalist robots. We have affective natures, right? A-F-F-E-C-T, affective natures. And we're also not very good at reporting on or analyzing our own motivations. That's something that's true about human beings. We usually exaggerate the role that our brains play in leading us to make a decision. In our giving, we do not usually act as Money for Good or the effective altruist would have us act, and I'm here to tell you that is a good thing. Who here has heard of effective altruism? Anyone? A few? Good, good. Yeah, it's a movement that seems to have lost a little bit of steam in the last several years, but essentially it's utilitarianism on steroids. One of its foremost proponents is a Princeton philosopher named Peter Singer. Catholics, like those in this room, really love Peter Singer for these warm and cuddly ideas about how it's okay to murder the sick and the elderly and post-birth infants and other cuddly things like that. He's the foremost proponent of effective altruism, or one of them. And basically, effective altruists argue that we are ethically obligated to direct our philanthropic dollars where they will do the most good for the most people. Sounds like utilitarianism if you remember your philosophy in college. It's a deceptively attractive position, but in practice, what it means is that we must ignore the ordo amoris, a term I thought I was going to be introducing into your lexicon here today. That was really weird. I was writing this, are you kidding me? Ordo amoris is being talked about? Yeah, the term that Vice President Vance and Pope Francis now have recently directed our attention to. Effective altruists would hold, for example, that if we have $1,000 at our disposal to give away, it would be wrong to use that to alleviate grandma's pain when it could save a life with a mosquito net in Asia, for example, right? That you can multiply the examples. That's essentially the idea. The ordo amoris, the idea that closeness of relationship, propinquity, or being part of a shared community ought to count for anything in our charitable giving is wrong, should count for nothing, those things. Now, most human beings, it turns out, disagree. And that's good. They seem to naturally believe in and tend to adhere to the Catholic concept of the order of love, which holds that we are first obligated to help those whom Providence has placed in our circle of care, starting with our spouses and parents and immediate family members and radiating out from there. Here's how Thomas Aquinas puts it. The order of nature is such that every natural agent pours forth its activity first and most of all on the things which are nearest to it. Therefore, we ought to be most beneficent toward those who are most closely connected with us. Elsewhere, he writes, one's obligation to love a person is proportionate to the gravity of the sin one commits in acting against this love. So I would say it turns out that most of us understand that implicitly. We are natural Thomists. If you want me to wade into the Vance-Vatican debate in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. I have a take that I think kind of lands in the middle in that debate. But basically, the effective altruist, not only is it sort of a morally monstrous position, it also doesn't really explain how people go about their giving. Now, why is it important to think about the defects of hyper-rational positions like effective altruism? Because we sometimes unintentionally fall into the trap of acting like donors think that way. That the way to speak their language, in a sense, is to make the most airtight, logical case we can for how our organization or school or ministry is going to give them the most bang for their buck, be the most good for the most people. My contention is that is not how most people think, even smart and sophisticated and wealthy people. And furthermore, that isn't even how we want them to think. So let me contrast Singer's effective altruism with another account of moral reasoning. It's the one offered by a sociologist named Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind. Is anybody familiar with that book or with Jonathan Haidt's work? No? He's leading the charge right now to get these out of schools, by the way. His book called The Anxious Generation, I would recommend to your attention. If we want to successfully connect with givers, we need to act like Haidt is more right than Singer. His understanding of human motivation is more right than Singer. So now, Haidt is essentially a Humean. Those of you who have studied philosophy, I'll look at Father here because I know he has, may have a chill go down your spine because David Hume is not exactly a friend of Catholicism or Thomism. But if we understand Haidt, as I'll explain here in a second, as giving an account of how most humans generally act and think most of the time, rather than an ideal account of how they should think, and certainly not an account of how humans must think, then we can take a lot of wise, counsel from him. Three things stand out to me. Haidt has this metaphor of the elephant and the rider. Has anybody heard this before? Very, very powerful for fundraisers. Great, guys. Basically, that describes the mind's dual nature. The conscious, rational part is the rider, and the subconscious, instinctual part, the lizard brain, that's the elephant. And the rider is notionally in control, but he can be overmatched by the much larger and more powerful elephant at any time, often without even knowing it. So that's a way of saying that we are, or at least often tend to be, post hoc reasoners. Post hoc reasoners. Our emotions make a decision, and then our brains justify that decision. Doesn't have to be that way. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's often how we are. We seek out and affirm arguments that confirm our identities. So what that means is we do not best persuade people with logic, but rather by appealing to their moral intuitions. And I'll talk a bit about more about this later. But here are the 6 dimensions, might be hard to see, they're at the bottom of the screen here, of our moral intuitions according to Haidt. There are moral taste buds. And basically his argument is that everybody, well, most people, respond to these kinds of buttons. Like that goes right to the lizard brain, goes right to the elephant. When somebody we think is being harmed and deserves care, someone's being oppressed, they deserve liberty. Someone's cheating, that's wrong, it's not fair. Betrayal, loyalty, and so forth. Sanctity, degradation might be one for us in this room. Does that make sense? Moral intuitions more than moral logic. Or rather, we can base our logic when we've activated these intuitions. We're going to get a better hearing for it. So, Money for Good found that donors are much more influenced by relationships and factors like propinquity and shared values than they are by demonstrated effectiveness, results, outcomes. Peter Singer hates all that, but his effective altruism doesn't seem to describe the real world, and it's contrary to Catholic teaching about the ordo amoris. It's also morally monstrous. And Jonathan Haidt's work, at least to me, seems to do a much better job describing people's moral reasoning and intuitions as they exist in the real world. So a few years ago, with all that in mind, I decided to dig deeper. I started looking at the social science research surrounding fundamental motivations and needs. Basically, I figured that the question, what motivates donors to give, was merely a subsidiary question to the larger question, what motivates humans to do anything? What are our fundamental human motivations? So it was then that I came across the work of a guy named Christian Smith, and he is a sociologist at Notre Dame. And fortunately, he had done all my work for me in a book called To Flourish or Destruct. He summarizes the entire literature, the entire scientific literature on the sources of human motivation. And he basically concludes that there are 6 basic human needs or goods, needs we are fundamentally motivated to fulfill. And here they are. Now, obviously, donors don't give as a way to achieve bodily survival, right? I don't think that's probably why people give. That's probably not too relevant. I don't know that giving conveys a more accurate knowledge of reality. But 2 things really, really stuck out to me on this list when I looked at it with my fundraiser's hat on. And that was identity, coherence, and affirmation, and social belonging and love. So think back to Money for Good's findings. Why do donors give? They give because they know someone. Social belonging, love. Why else do they give? The organization shares their values. That's identity, coherence, and affirmation. Why else do they give? The organization is local. Well, that's both of those things, right? That's both social belonging and love, and identity, coherence, and affirmation. So I zeroed in on identity and belonging as 2 keys to understanding what the heck we are doing as fundraisers. So I'm going to elaborate on these concepts a bit. What are we talking about exactly? So first, we are all fundamentally motivated to construct or create and affirm a particular identity, we have a fundamental need to know who we are. We see this in the world today, right? We've heard about identity politics. People are searching for who they are. Identity, the sources of identity have thinned out. They've eroded. It's clear that people have a need to have an identity, to construct an identity and affirm an identity. We're also motivated to be part of something larger than ourselves. We have a need to belong. Once again, Father James talked about the loneliness epidemic that we are undergoing in this country right now, or in the world, really the Western world. We have that epidemic because we have this fundamental need. We have a need to belong to something larger than ourselves, something meaningful, and that need is often not being met. People don't feel like they belong to anything bigger than them. So these are interrelated concepts. I like to think of identity as the fruit of belonging. So belonging confers identity. I heard Arthur Brooks say just that at a recent event, that community confers identity. Same idea. Belonging confers identity. However, it can also go the other way. Adopting an identity can also initiate me into a group. So the arrow goes both ways here, and they're kind of interrelated, and that's why I present them together. These are very interrelated fundamental needs. So in any case, our working hypothesis is that we can motivate donors by feeding and tapping into these needs. I believe that's what great fundraisers do. I believe that's what great fundraising programs do. I believe that's what great asks or invitations do, at least implicitly. I think that's the secret sauce to how they work when they're at their best. Great fundraisers are able to show prospective supporters how giving in support of a particular mission affirms and strengthens some important component of their identity. Somehow, it helps them have an enhanced sense of who they are. And great fundraisers also call people into and allow them to experience community with others. They provide people with a sense of belonging, of playing a central role in a joint enterprise that is life-giving and fruitful. So one result of this approach to fundraising is that donors can come to truly identify with an organization and its mission. I think that's why membership language is so strong. I'm a member of my parish. I'm a member of my college alumni club. I'm a member of the NRA. I'm a member of the ACLU. And membership language is really strong. It's tapping into this need for identity and belonging. And the second result is that donors come to believe themselves as belonging to a community that includes, but is much larger than an organization's leadership and staff. So you think of a community of alumni, a church community, the pro-life community. So if there's one thing for you to take away from this presentation, is that as a Catholic nonprofit leader, you most want and need to tap into and feed these basic human needs of identity and belonging. Now, it's not enough. Typically, you can't just blandly come up and invite people to join your community. Hey, come and enhance your identity with me. That's not how it works. There are particular ways by which we come to think of ourselves as members of a community, particular ways in which we incorporate something new into our identities. So I'm going to talk about 3 of those ways, and they're going to be highly familiar to you because Andrew and Conde and others have talked about these. We're just putting them in a new framework. First way is story, second is relationship, and the third is experiences. So the first way to tap into and nurture identity and belonging is via story. We've heard about this a lot already this week. We see ourselves as actors in stories. We're all the protagonists in a film strip that's continually unreeling in our heads, right? Like we are in a story. Stories help us determine who we are. They help us determine what we believe in. They even help us determine what we should do next. Stories are central to our identities. Think of all the time you're like, you're trying to decide on something like, that's not me. That's not me, right? It's not part of my identity. It's not part of my story. There's a massive literature testifying to all this in theology, philosophy, psychology, and sociology. I'll read The Catholic philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, with whom I hope most of you are familiar, has said man is essentially a storytelling animal. But because he is something of a Thomist, MacIntyre adds, but a teller of stories that aspire to truth. Storytelling is our nature, but it's not just any kind of story to which we are attracted most. We want to tell and live stories that aspire to truth. So I'll talk about some of the principles of doing story well here in a bit. You've already heard about that from Andrew. But suffice to say that one story is worth 1,000 data points. I think it's important for nonprofit leaders. We always say to our clients, like, remember one good, powerful statistic, right? One good, powerful statistic. But better to remember just one powerful story. Andrew told you 3 stories you should remember, right? But you've got to have a good, powerful story, worth more than all the numbers you could ever think of. So as fundraisers, the way I put it here is we need to tell good, compelling, attractive stories and help donors join their story with our story in a way that advances a happy plot. That's how I would think about one of our tasks, how we tap into identity and belonging with story. All right, relationship. Everybody up here is talking about relationships. We all know how important relationships are. And it's obvious right within this framework. I mean, there can be no sense of belonging without relationship, real relationship. And we know that people's identities are built and given a shape within a network of relationships. You think about the way you might describe who you are, it's all relational, right? I'm a husband, I'm an uncle, I'm a boss, whatever it might be. I'm a child of God. Always has some sort of relational aspect to it. So as nonprofit leaders, we need to find ways to enter into genuine, deep relationships with our donors. Now, I know that's obvious. You all know that you can't skip this. I have known nonprofit leaders who try. Have you? It's pretty impressive. People are like, there was a very impressive woman who has led an organization that was a client of ours. Where's Anthony? He's going to know who I'm talking about. And she did not get this. She didn't want to meet with people, didn't want to build relationships. It's all about ROI anyway. I know that's what our donors want. Why can't we just slide across a piece of paper across the desk, show them the numbers, and they should give? Does that work? We know that doesn't work. She found out it doesn't work. She's at another organization now. That doesn't work. You can't skip it at all. We'll talk about ways to do relationship well here in a second. And then the third way to tap into and nurture identity and belonging is via experiences. So our own stories, our own identities are very clearly shaped by the experiences we have, right? Both good and bad things. We can all think of examples, maybe an accident, a divorce of our parents or of ourselves. Maybe an experience where we discover that we're really good at something, or we experience the presence of God and adoration or something like that. Experiences are very important to shaping our identities and giving us also a sense of belonging, because when we share experiences with others, it strengthens our sense of belonging and fellow feeling. And the more intense and vivid the experience, the more intense that feeling is. Think of a football team. Think of the military. Think of a group of people galvanized by a harrowing experience with a terrible boss like Nick. Just kidding. Nick, just making sure he's listening if he's around. So, as nonprofit leaders, we should look for ways to give donors positive experiences. The more intense and vivid, the better, with their organization and with one another. So I'll give some more real-life examples here in a little while. But basically, this is the upshot. This is the framework by which we think about fundraising. It organizes everything. What are we trying to do? We're trying to tap into and nurture identity and belonging through stories, relationships, and experiences. Nonprofits who do the best job telling stories, building relationships, and creating opportunities for shared, meaningful experiences will have the most success in obtaining donor support. I think there's a lot of data that backs this up, and I'm going to tell you about some of it here in a second. I do, though, want to point out what is different about all this. You might think, this is really obvious, but a lot of non-fundraisers or new fundraisers, maybe one of your board members or bosses, they often think donors are motivated by having excess wealth, right? He's got a lot of money. You've heard this before. And so if we present a need, they'll fork it over. But someone being rich does not make them a good donor prospect necessarily, as you all know. Other fundraisers believe that sympathy is what we are aiming to activate, and therefore we need to send up a cry for help. Now, the efficacy of that kind of appeal dries up fast. I'd call that the needy girlfriend or the needy boyfriend kind of appeal. Works for a little bit until you want to run away and never see them again. And then more sophisticated fundraisers believe that donors want ROI above all else. And therefore, what we need to do is to build effective, quantifiably accessible programs, and we'll draw those donors to our side. And I think that's a little bit trickier. So it is true that many people, especially major donors, will tell you they care about ROI. But remember, donors, like all humans, are amazingly bad at accurately reporting on their own motivations. So we don't need to take things at face value. The way I understand this is, for many people, caring about ROI, caring about metrics and impact and outcomes and so forth, is an important part of their identities. So that means we just need to incorporate that part of their identity into the sorts of stories we tell, into the way we try to draw them into a relationship. It does not mean that we therefore forget about storytelling, relationship building, and meaningful experiences. So it's not enough to slide that chart over, to slide over the graph, to send the numbers, and to wait for the check to appear. I have a friend here in Phoenix who's a really good man, and he's been very successful, sold his company a few years ago. And he is this guy. He is this guy to a T. I am rational. I give rationally. I want my money to be effective where it goes. I care about outcomes. I care about impact, all that stuff, right? Where have his biggest gifts gone? They've gone to his 2 alma maters, where his identity was formed. He openly talks about how they saved his life, shaped his entire career. They are not producing anything remotely like the kind of outcomes he would want. But what do? First of all, they tap into his identity. That's easy to do. And they build relationships very well. They also provide really vivid, meaningful experiences like flying him on the private jet with the basketball team, the suite at the football game, all the things. And he overlooks all the ways in which they disappoint him every day, and makes multi-million-dollar gifts to those organizations. Identity, belonging counts for way more. His heart made that decision, and his head now justifies it. He stopped making those gifts, said, I'm never making a higher ed gift again. And I was like, all right, that's very wise. That's where you are, it's a very rational move. Coming to the next board meetings like I'm making a huge gift to a local university. They tapped right back into him. Going to use his book in their business school class. Just brought him right in, did it so well. And I'm not saying anything this was manipulative, nothing like that, but his identity is someone whose life story is going to help young people. And he doesn't think about it that way himself, but that's clearly what it is. So ROI, sometimes it's just a box you have to check off, but it's not necessarily the fundamental thing you need to speak to. I hope that makes sense. All right, so as I said, data, I think, backs up this model. Just a few data points for you to consider from some of the survey work we've done at AmPhil. Somebody, Nick, who's not here, I don't think, because he didn't respond to me making fun of him earlier, he said before about donor clubs, like, hey, don't have that on your giving page, right? And I'm sure he's right. But major donor clubs work. They work. Groups with organizationally important major donor clubs, by which I mean they're real, they meant something to the organization, they're activated, they're not just a piece of paper, raise 50% more per year from their donors than do groups without such clubs. They give a sense of belonging. They also they kind of enhance your identity, to be honest with you. You do feel a little bit different when you hit the first rung in the major donor club. Like, I've done something with my life. I'm not the total failure that my 3rd grade teacher told me I would be, and so forth and so on. Meetings, the number of meetings, we all know you have to meet. We say that, but the data shows that too. Number of meetings per development staffer positively correlated with organizational growth rate. How much are you meeting? The more you mail, but especially the more non-solicitation mailings you send, the more you invest in building a relationship and not treating the donor like a walking ATM. not thinking about that just in a transactional fashion. We also once did a study with a group. They're pretty big groups. They had some good data. How many meetings did it take before a donor made his or her first $10,000 gift? Anybody want to guess how many meetings that was? Not quite 30. Oh, 3. Okay, I thought you said 30. I was like, wow, that's a lot. 7 or 8. It was 7 to 8 meetings before a donor made his or her first $10,000 gift. So relationship building, so important. And then there's some really interesting findings in the literature. Anybody here follow Russell James? Good, a lot of you. He's great, right? He's at Texas Tech, really comes out of the plan giving world, but he does a lot of writing and research in development. Highly recommend you follow him on LinkedIn. All his stuff is free. And I love a couple of findings that he has. One, brain imaging, some neuroscience research, which I always kind of take with a big grain of salt. But this is kind of interesting. Charitable giving lights up the same areas of the brain that are engaged in social cognition, suggesting that giving is a social act. I think that's of interest to what we're talking about here. And this one I really love. When donors decided to make a large gift, regions of the brain associated with visualized autobiography light up. Literally lights up, what is my story? What is my own story? What's my identity? When it is the same area of the brain that's lighting up when donors decide to make a big gift. And then Jen Sheng. Anybody know Jen Sheng? A couple? All right, good. Yeah, she's the Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy in the UK and studies love. I love that. Love as integral to philanthropy. And just a couple of findings of hers that why people give is fundamentally a matter of who they are. She talks about the multiple kinds of identity that are out there. And then also her finding that delivering connection, delivering belongingness, we might say, leads to donors experiencing a higher level of well-being, which then leads to increased donor support. I don't have a great name for this framework that I've been talking to you about. I've always remembered it as identity, belonging, stories, relationships, experiences, but that doesn't make a good word. That says IBSR, and IBSR is not great. But buyers, I kind of like, because we are trying to bring people into our mission to buy into what we're doing. So if you need a way to think about this, that's the best I can do, buyers. If you got a better one, please let me know. I'm in the market. All right, so, and again, Andrew did a lot of this morning, but I'll just shift to talking about some concrete ways in which we might do stories, relationships, and experiences well from this perspective. So the first thing, I really like the classic story structure that you find in fairy tales. You want to write a compelling story, just rip off the fairy tale structure. There's a reason these things have been around for as long as writing itself has been around, right? And it's context, problem, consequences, resolution. Context, there was a Catholic university in Fargo, North Dakota. Problem. The average temperature in Fargo is minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's in May. Consequences. The university decided to build underground heated tunnels that connected all the buildings so nobody ever had to go outside. Resolution, enrollment shot up by 50%. I just made that up on the spot, by the way. I know it's so easy to use this structure, but it's a structure that everybody kind of recognizes and resonates with. Jonathan Haidt, we already saw this, is the source for these 6 kind of moral taste buds, or moral intuitions. Understanding and appealing to them is very important, more than to intellect. Not saying instead of intellect. I'm not saying intellect doesn't matter. I'm not saying we should lie. I'm not saying we should manipulate, nothing like that. But if you want to even get the intellect to start paying attention, you have to activate our moral intuitions, right? So if you can hit these buttons in your appeals, in your cases for support, in your oral talking to a donor, those are good buttons to hit. The third, I guess I'll talk about this maybe a little bit more later, kind of allow the donor to be the hero. We too often, I always tell people, check your pronouns, by which I mean, make sure we refers to the donor and you. The donors are on the team. Donors are part of the philanthropy team. They're on the team. It's not we and you, it's we. And the donor is the hero. The organization is not the hero. Even Monsignor Shea is not the hero, right? The donor is the hero. So our stories have to make room for that to happen. And then we know we need to communicate an awful lot to get those stories out there. Anybody know this book by Kendra Hall, Stories That Stick? Is that familiar? She has these key characteristics of sticky stories. And I won't go through all of these, but I think they're important because you'll see that they allow us to really truly enter into it and identify with the story that's being told, especially like identifiable characters and so forth. I really like this last part. So Shark Tank, who doesn't like Shark Tank? We all watch Shark Tank. Everybody loves Kevin O'Leary. Now that should be the most rational thing in the world, right? These are sharks. These are rational investors, right? They're just making the best decision they possibly can. They are seeking ROI. What do people use to appeal to the sharks? They use stories that appeal to their emotions. A disturbing number of the people cry. Am I right? It's like, they're crying again, you know? But the pitches that use stories are much more likely to get deals than the ones without. So even in this sort of these highly rational situations, we see how humans really operate. A few more practical tips on story from the research on the psychology of giving. Lisa Wentz isn't here right now, I think, but she was saying, we used to tell these really gloomy stories. They're very, very sad, and it's true. We don't want to tell too gloomy a story. Our stories, we need to have hope on the horizon in the stories we tell. But we also don't want to tell resolved, happy stories. Happy stories are fine, but they shouldn't typically be fully resolved, because then there's no way for the donor to enter in and help resolve it in a happy way. Does that make sense? So we don't want the person whose kidneys were stolen and they were put in the ice bath in the hotel room and woke up, but then the kidney salvation team came in and that's all done now. We want her to still be in the ice bath in our appeals, but you can do this, Mr. or Mrs. Donor. I know it's a terrible example, but we all know that story, right? So we want cliffhangers. We want cliffhangers that allow the donor to enter into the story. Statistics. The research says, and this is counterintuitive, I admit, I have a hard time doing this. Statistics are much less helpful than we think. In fact, there is even some research to suggest that they are harmful, that putting statistics in our appeals, in our cases, actually hurts the compelling nature of our case. And the thinking there seems to be that they activate a certain part of the brain that isn't very helpful when it comes to giving. I will say here is the one place where Joseph Stalin had some wisdom. He made the quote that at least is attributed to him: "One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic." So if you're going to use statistics, you can lose humanity in statistics, in other words, right? And we don't want to be like Stalin. I think that's fair to say. Same with victims. We want concrete victims, not numbers. And oddly, one victim is better than 2, and is certainly better than 3, and is certainly better than 5, and is certainly better than 10. All the research indicates that one victim is better than multiple victims. Don't ask me why. Once again, I think we just our brains go into this statistics abstract territory, and we get away from the humanity of it. And then last, within that classic story structure, that fairy tale structure I was talking about, or perhaps as variations of that structure, we have sort of, in human literature, we have this library of recognizable narratives that the best story is always coming back to. Band of Brothers, The Shared Enemy, got to be careful with that one. The Contrarian Underdog, that's the Moneyball kind of plot, the Trailblazer, and so forth. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but to do story well, we do well to copy the classic story structures that have survived through time. Russell James is good on this, as he is on so much. Um, Pulling out the donor's own story and casting it in the right structure is an amazingly effective and honoring way to set up an ask. So James suggests, I love this way of thinking about it, that the fundraiser ought to see his or her work as a Socratic adventure. We are the donor's guiding sage. We're his or her Virgil or Obi-Wan Kenobi, if you prefer. So then the goal is to ask those questions which will show the donor a heroic path, thereby making the donor's story a hero story. So here's the framework James proposes, and note how important the concept of identity is here. We want to learn the donor's backstory and identity and connect it to our mission and the problem that our mission addresses. James suggests next we want to prod the donor to define what victory looks like, or what a victory looks like, and then engage them to reflect on the identity aspects that would make that victory personally meaningful. And finally, present a challenge that, if overcome, would result in that meaningful victory and enhanced identity. That sounds very abstract, but I'm going to give you a very specific way to do this. Note, though, that this all rests, this whole framework, on the understanding that human psychology is such that we naturally seek out and respond to opportunities to affirm and strengthen our identity. That's the key insight here. So here's the framework. If you're ever looking for a good framework for your asks, if you're on the front lines doing fundraising, it's a great framework. Very easy to use. Very easy to use, has 3 parts. And it's always, you have, you understand, would you consider? Has anybody ever seen this before? I'd love this. Very easy to remember. You have been a leader in advancing Catholic apologetics. So right now, I'm reminding you who you are. Reminding you of a really important part of your identity. You understand how effective expert apologetics can be in bringing people into the church. So now I've just kind of laid out what a victory would look like. And then I'm going to issue the challenge. Would you consider a gift of $100,000 that would allow us to hire a full-time apologist whose work will literally save souls? That make sense? You understand, would you consider, I am tapping into identity. I'm presenting a challenge that allows the donor's story to be a heroic story and setting forth a path to getting to an affirmed or strengthened identity. I think that's pretty good. Now, by the way, implicit in all this is not just identity, but also belonging, because what we're doing is we're inviting the donor into a community of people with the same principles and the same goals so that the challenge can be effectively addressed. All right, so that story, almost done here. To relationships. I'm very tempted to say, Father James, since you said this yesterday, I feel like I can say this, that if we want to learn how to do relationships well, think about what most parishes do and don't do any of that. I was an evangelical, or as a Protestant anyway, for my first, 25 years of my life. And you couldn't go to a church where they wouldn't know your name by the time you walked out the door. And I think I was a Catholic for 20 years before a pastor ever knew my name. Now, that's partly on me, because I'm not a joiner, right? Joining the Catholic Church was the biggest joining thing I'd ever done. But we're not great, oftentimes, at doing relationships at the parish level, I think it's fair to say. Meeting being one of those things, right? Meet. You cannot meet too often. Nothing works like a meeting in building relationships. The data says that, and all the best practices we all know tells us that. You can't, most nonprofits are really underinvested in their ability to do the number of meetings that they need to do. I mean, Focus, we have a lot of their philanthropy engagement people here today. There are 8,100 of these people around the country. I'm kidding, of course, but how many are there? Everybody's like, yeah, 8,100. There's 8,100 Focus people. How many of you are there? Yeah, no, on your staff, development staff, frontline. Yeah. 40. It's pretty big, right? It's bigger than most in here. I have a friend here in town, Paul Mulligan here I'm looking at, knows very well. He loves to tell us how many gift officers the University of Michigan has, right? 700, something like that. Notre Dame has about that many. St. Jude's has hundreds. Those are kind of crazy numbers in a way, but also something of a challenge. We are typically underinvested in our ability to build relationships and to do the meetings we need to do. People have already talked about the need to be authentic and vulnerable. That's very important words. I hate those words personally. It sounds kind of too like 80s sensitive guy kind of words, but they are important. And I'm glad that Conde brought that up yesterday, that you have to the give and take. You can't just be the listener always. You have to give something of yourself for it to become a real relationship. Something I always mention, I'm not sure anybody ever takes me up on it, but the best fundraisers I ever knew were not afraid. They were so invested in the relationship being real and so invested in the good of the other person that they were not afraid to introduce that person to other nonprofits who they thought would help them advance their goals effectively, their philanthropic goals. That's a great fundraiser. That's a real relationship. If this person's philanthropic passion and goals is over here, you're doing right by them to introduce them to somebody else. That'll come back to you. That really builds trust too. You want to build trust with the donor. That's a really good way to do it. We know we need to have good manners and show the results of our gift, and we know we want to not always be asking, but also not wasting people's time by not asking ever. So we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. And then shared experiences. So many ways to do shared experiences well. Events are a huge pain in the butt. We all know that. They are so time-consuming and costly, but they are good if they're done well in providing the vivid and intense and meaningful experiences that make people feel closer to us, like there's a sense of belonging and identity. One of the great events that I go to every year here is not a gala. Who here doesn't do a gala? Keep it that way as long as you possibly can, right? Galas are fine, but you could do other kinds of events, especially for people who are already your supporters, that have maybe nothing to do with your mission. So you're familiar with whiskey tasting or a shooting thing or something if you're in Texas. The one here that I really like, it's put on by a guy who's the chief philanthropy officer at St. Vincent de Paul here in town, and it's called Caddy Talks. Every year here in town, there's the Phoenix Open, the Waste Management Open. It's a big golf tournament. And he knows he's got a lot of donors who are golf guys and golf women. And so he made friends with a caddy. The caddy at the time was a caddy for, I forget, Bubba, somebody or other, Bubba Watson. And now he's a caddy for Scotty Scheffler, who's the world's #1 golfer. And this guy was very happy to get together on the Tuesday before the Open, the place, and he could bring another couple caddies, and we'll have it called Caddy Talks, and it's free, and it has nothing to do with St. Vincent de Paul. And about 20 people showed up the first time. Now they have to close the doors. It's so packed. Everybody wants to get in. PGA golfers come to it now. It's not a fundraiser. It's not a pitch. It has nothing to do with St. Vincent de Paul's mission. You won't be surprised that golf is not a huge part of St. Vincent de Paul's mission. But what it is a meaningful experience for people to get to sit in a little room and talk about golf and, all the stuff that goes with that and Tiger Woods or whatever, with people who know what they're talking about. And the organization made that possible. And they meet other people in the room that they get to know and become friends with, and now they're golfing with them. St. Vincent de Paul made that possible. They raise a lot more money from people who have come to those events now than they ever did before. And they didn't have to make an ask. They didn't have to introduce them to the mission. They didn't have to wheel out people who could speak to the effectiveness of the mission. They just provided a vivid, meaningful experience that the people in the room could not have gotten for themselves. Does that make sense? I don't know how else to do that, right? You can't just replicate caddy talks everywhere. It's kind of a weird thing to do. But there's something like that for you. There's multiple things like that for you. And the point is the level of the experience that you made it possible. It's not so much about what the content of the experience is. So all sorts of ways to do that, which I don't necessarily need to go into much more here. I will say, I have up here recognizing publicly and by name, although that could really go in the identity section. You may wonder, why do people do that? Why do people ever thank their donors publicly on a wall or in a program? on a plaque. I mean, why would you do that? You're telling everybody who your donor is. But what it does is it really strengthens both identity, that sense of identity, first of all. That leads to an enhanced and affirmed identity on the part of the donor, oftentimes. And it also creates a sense of belonging. My name, or my parents' name, or somebody else I wanted to honor is on a room, on the conference room at your headquarters. I'm tied to you in a way. I have a sense of belonging with you in a way that I just wouldn't have otherwise. Like, that's important, right? And so that's why those things matter. And that's why the most successful nonprofit organizations do that kind of thing. All right, so this is it. I know you, the folks in this room have heard about the so-called golden questions. These are just a few of them. And I just want to end by pointing out that the best fundraisers formulate these questions precisely in such a way as to draw out who the donor is at his or her core. They are very much aimed at activating identity and belonging, often by drawing out stories and getting donors to think about their most important relationships and communities, including very much their relationship with God and the community that is the church. So look, everybody's bringing Jesus into their presentations this week, and I'm going to do the same thing here to end up, all right? Jesus told stories. He built relationships. He and his followers had some rather intense experiences. He didn't make arguments. He spoke to people's hearts. So if he wasn't too good to advance the kingdom by leveraging human psychology, neither should we be, right? So thanks. Questions? Yeah.
So I found it really interesting talking about identity and how to create that. And, you're at an organization where you have donors throughout the entire country, throughout the world, and you're in charge of a specific territory. How do you cultivate that relationship in that specific city that you're in with donors who are all people in the organization but don't know each other, have no connection to that specific area? How do you cultivate that?
Okay, so you say if you're a regional gift officer, basically, how do you create relationship, or they don't know? Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure you're already doing a lot of the main things. Obviously, you're going to meet with these people or trying to meet with them. Do you find difficulty in doing that?
No, I don't mind, but it's more like, people are giving and they love the organization, but say, oh, who else do you know in the area that's giving this organization? Oh, I don't know anyone.
Yeah. So, yeah, you can always like have somebody host something at a club, or I don't know, I can't tell how wide this region is. Is this like 500 miles across or 50 miles across? But yeah, hosting little. Hey, I would love for to connect you with our other supporters in this area, because you guys you share so many things in common, right? So, what would you want to host something at your house sometime? Maybe just like it's not an ask, just bring people together.
What's the size of those events in your that makes it big?
How big's the house? Yeah, I mean, you can see those things going from 10 people, 6 people to 100 people, I love the idea, though, of connecting supporters with one another, because it just increases that sense of, hey, I'm in a community here. I'm doing something together with other people. And now I see myself in these other people too. It's not just me, right? I'm picking up all these other things. Giving is a social act. So my immediate thought is, ask somebody if they'd ever want to host something that would just allow your supporters to get together and get to know each other and maybe make some new friends. And you can take all the pressure off. It doesn't have to be a fundraiser. It doesn't have to be anything, right? If they host it, and people can bring somebody if they want to as well. That's what I would think. Yeah.
What was the statistic you shared? Is it 8 meetings before someone's...
7 to 8 meetings was one study that we did across a few organizations before somebody had given. They have to have good data on this, right? So I don't know how representative it is, but before somebody gave their first $10,000 gift, typically they had been met with 7 to 8 times before they made that gift. Which just proves the larger point, right, is that most $10,000 plus givers don't start out as $10,000 plus givers, contrary to what every board member seems to think. they start at $50 even, $100, you know, and you meet with them, you build a relationship, they go from there. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I was just thinking, could you talk about you said don't share statistics with donors?
Yeah, don't overhear that. Don't overhear that. The research is that it actually makes stories or asks less compelling to include statistics. I'm just the messenger on that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but what I think it is like you don't want people in a place of abstraction when you're inviting them to make a gift to your mission. You want them in a place of humanity, if that makes sense, and concreteness. And every statistic is by definition a generalization across cases. And we want to get away from generalizations. So I think that's what the finding is. But of course you need to know some statistics about your organization. So let's not overhear that. Yeah? My only caution on that is, like I was saying, you got to incorporate people's analytical natures, the engineer, whatever, the business person, that's a part of their identity. You need to speak to that. But even they still need to hear a story. That's the only thing I would add. Like, maybe not engineers, because they're only barely human, let's be honest. Just kidding. Yeah.
But then have them say, tell me about your grandchildren.
Yeah.
And have them center in on personal experience from that statistic.
Right.
And that can be helpful.
It's good.
You can hear the big picture and say, hey, it's affecting your life.
That's good. Do we have time for Paul? One more. Ordo Amoris. Here's my take. Jesus did not subvert the Ordo Amoris. He extended it, both horizontally and vertically. Vertically to be God before all else, even before our parents and our families, right? We hear that in the Gospels. And horizontally to take the ripples outward even further to include the stranger and the foreigner. And with that, I give it to you.
Thank you, Chairman.